SECfans.com. We're here. It's finally week one, and you know what? We missed you guys. Last week we did a little bit of an hors d'oeuvre to our main course this week. We talked about the SEC East and West, where we thought they would shake out over the course of the season. I don't think we really predicted an SEC champion, but we did go in detail in terms of why we thought each one of those teams would shake out where they would. So it's probably an interesting discussion if you missed our show last week. Obviously, you can catch the podcast audio on the website, or you can catch the video link below. We also discussed some coaching changes that were impactful both in the SEC and outside of the SEC. This week, before we get into our discussions, just want to remind y'all, if you could help us out real big and subscribe down below. Hit that subscribe link, and that way you get notifications. I know y'all find us through search, and we usually rank pretty well in search, but we want you to get that notification as soon as we publish live. And that way we can get into some discussions in the future that aren't just game-driven discussions, that get more into the numbers, because it's hard to search and find that kind of stuff. And if we ever want to do like a live stream where Josh and I talk about a game while it's going on and we do a live chat, that's something we're trying to plan for this year. It'd be great if you had that heads up. So, okay, remember subscribe. Also remember to comment below. Let us know what you think. And Georgia fans, we're not going to talk about your team much this week, and it's not because we don't love you. It's just because you're playing Austin P, and there's not a lot of discussion to be had there. So go back, watch the SEC East discussion, listen to it on the podcast, and that way you can have a little bit of an insight as to what we think about your team this year. Subject to change. Okay, so let's get into it. First game I want to talk about is Auburn and Washington. Last week, we discussed, and we've always discussed, about how Gus Malzahn's offense is super potent when they've got the powerful offensive line, the super great blocking fullback, and the power run game running back or running backs plural. And we saw that last year with Kerryon Johnson stepping up and actually kind of being that power back. And when he got hurt last year, it really changed the dynamics of that offense. Well, Jarrett Stidham's got another year in this system. He's got some comfort level that maybe he didn't have to start the season like with Clemson last year. So what I want to discuss first, because we will get into Washington and what we think about that defense, and hint, I think it's pretty good. We don't know what Josh is going to say yet, but we're pretty high on Washington, have been for a couple of years. So before we get into the discussion about Washington, talk a little bit about what you think about Auburn's offensive potential this year, given their maybe deficiencies at running back and offensive line. I'll let you take it and run with it to get us started for 2018. Let's hear it, Josh.
I think it's a long time narrative with Auburn football that when Auburn has a dual threat quarterback, they're an extremely potent offense. And the two of us have discussed this going on a few years now with this show. It's probably a little bit more complicated than that. And I think the first thing to note is, we go back this, I think, every season, and we'll touch on it again to start this season. You have to look at the roots that Gus Malzahn came from. Gus Malzahn learned the Todd Graham offense, right? When he was at Arkansas, in that sort of half season he served there under Houston Nutt, he ran a pass-first offense. He brought in a quarterback, I think was his name, Mitch Mustaine from Springdale, Arkansas, where he was the head coach. Came in, threw the ball a lot of receiver screens, the same hurry-up concepts we've seen since then. But the biggest thing is it was pass first. It was a pass spread offense. I don't know that you could say it's a lot like what Kingsbury runs, because it was much more of a short yardage offense, but not really resembling what we've seen today. What happened is Malzahn went to Tulsa, was the offensive coordinator. Todd Graham obviously runs a zone read, run first spread offense, has had a good amount of success with that with dual threat quarterbacks of late. And that's where Malzahn sort of married these concepts, took it to Auburn, obviously won a national title in 2010, hopped around. And what I think we've seen from him is sort of a difficulty in sticking to what works. The thing that made him really great was when he married his hurry up, no huddle concepts with the power run game with a dual threat quarterback that he learned at Tulsa. And I don't think really either one of us truly believe it's the dual threat quarterback necessarily that's the key there. It certainly helps. I think both of us argue that when he has a dual threat quarterback, then he operates a power run scheme. And it's extremely hard to stop Auburn, particularly late in the year when they do that. Now, Malzahn's system, it's there's a whole book, literally a book that Malzahn wrote it on the concepts, but his offense is based on the idea that you go in practice, you get as many clean reps as possible, meaning you play with minimal resistance from the defense. You run it over and over again, and you get it to where you can run your play exactly right against air. Then you start giving yourself a little more competition in practice, and then mainly look for games to get real contact reps. But you're trying to build this offense to hit gaps, hit seams, operate at a very high level, and be mentally ready to run play to play, and the other team isn't ready for it. And, by and large, we see that every year with Auburn. They're usually a second half of the season team, but it's when they have those power run concepts, when they're hitting you in the nose over and over again, and they usually have very good talent at running back and at guard and at tackle, that they can kind of overwhelm you. And late in the season, there's such a machine with those concepts that are really good. Now, to sort of tie all this whole discussion together, the problem is when they don't have that power run game. I think Auburn and Gus Malzahn gets a little over creative. We saw that last year with the Clemson game where they started running a lot of really odd concepts. They tried to put some wing T stuff in there with a fullback throwing the football. None of it really made sense. None of it worked. And they kind of about halfway through the season hit the reset button and went back to Kerryon Johnson. So my concern is really twofold. One, Kerryon Johnson was a great back, and with the offensive line they had, they were able to lean on him and have a lot of success. But two, the concern is if they don't have those weapons and they've got a quarterback now that's a real passer, it's not just sort of what the talent is that they had in Kerryon Johnson and how good Cam Martin is. And frankly, I don't think Cam Martin is nearly the running back that Kerryon Johnson is. But it goes a lot more to how do they adjust from that, and in the past, he's overcompensated.
So when you say Kerryon Johnson, or when you say Cam Martin wasn't the running back that Kerryon Johnson was, do you mean just in general skill set, or do you mean scheme fit for Auburn specifically?
Probably a little bit of both. Kerryon Johnson was a powerful back that could gain yards at contact. He also had the speed to break away. Cam Martin is a much smaller guy, doesn't go through contact nearly as well. We didn't see him all that much in the end of the year because he got kind of beat up. I think he tweaked his ankle there in the Alabama game, if I remember correctly. And because of that, it took the speed element out of the game. But because of the concepts they want to run at Auburn, because of everything we're talking about, this Todd Graham offense that they've sort of integrated, they need to be able to run off guard. They need to be able to run off tackle. That takes size and power. And so Cam Martin, I don't know that he's quite the talent Johnson is. Johnson is an NFL tailback. That's not a huge slight by any means against Cam Martin. Not everybody can be Bo Jackson, right? Some guys are going to be really, really good. The next guy may be quite good. He just may not be what the guy before him was. That's probably the case with Martin and Johnson. But the problem is, in particular, Auburn, whenever they've been successful, has power at the running back position. Because if you have power at running back, that lets you run the dive play, the running back running right up the center. And all those zone read concepts are usually built around the quarterback doing a read where the quarterback either hands off to the running back inside based off what the defensive end's doing. And if the defensive end bites hard, then the quarterback goes outside. Then they take that and they branch off passing components where the quarterback gets outside the pocket. If the running back can't get those hard yards in between the tackles, then that whole set of counters and all kind of falls apart. Because now the defense doesn't have to really respect the running back up the middle. The DN doesn't bite down, and they can play you straight up.
All right, so for the Washington fans that don't necessarily follow Auburn that much, they're used to maybe a little different style of offense on the West Coast. When we're talking about running backs in the offensive scheme for Auburn, a lot of times we've talked about in the past, and I'm going to say this is kind of a global concept. I know it's overly simplistic, but for spread offenses, which, there's a lot of nuance in Auburn's offense. But for spread offense, we often talk about how they like to leverage talented players in space to either marginalize a talent gap or to really clobber almost anybody short of elite competition. But Auburn, it seems like, is a little different in that they don't run an overly complex spread style, space heavy scheme. Talk about a little bit the simplicity of Auburn's offense and what makes it brutally effective, and why there may be an opportunity for Washington early. You mentioned a little bit late, how they're really good late. Talk about why they're really good late, and maybe there's opportunities early that you don't get in November against Auburn.
Auburn's scheme, we mentioned earlier Todd Graham. So I think the first thing, obviously, Washington fans have a little bit of exposure to what Auburn runs because they've seen Arizona State play. So when they're in a groove, when they've been really good, their offense, again, is running an adapted version of what Todd Graham runs. They run it a little bit faster than what Graham runs on average. But to your point, there's not a whole lot of sophistication with the way that Auburn runs their routes and creates complexity downfield. Their sophistication is the number of options really that can run off each play. And again, it all stems from the inability from a defense to be able to stop those inside power plays. And when I say that, what I'm referring to is some offenses are designed to create space and create throwing lanes. In the pack, you definitely see that from teams like USC that run a traditional pro style offense where they're designed to get routes downfield. To a certain extent, I think Washington has been another team that does that. Certainly was under Sark. And the routes are pretty complicated in terms of what you're asking the receivers to do, and they tend to be quite complicated in what you're asking the quarterback to process, evaluate, and how to execute that offense. It takes a lot of time to learn those schemes and systems. It takes a lot of time to get the quarterback up to speed, to understand what his reads are, to make the correct checks, et cetera, et cetera. With Auburn, they're taking all that off the quarterback. They're not asking him to process as much information. You're not asking the receivers to read coverage, bend the routes in and out, stop the route short, depending on whether it's press or bail. What you're instead doing is you're saying, okay, instead of having all this complexity for the quarterback, we're going to run a simple play. This simple play is going to have a first variation, a second variation, a third variation, a fourth variation. They have play cards on the side of the field. They're going to hold up the play card. That's going to tell the quarterback what to do. And so the hybrid scheme is sort of taking that Todd Graham concept, but then at the snap, and quite frequently you'll see Auburn come to the line of scrimmage, line up, do a hard count, look back to the sideline. And what they're doing is they're trying to see what the defense is set, look to the sideline, and then the coaches are going to call the particular play to be run. So whatever variation they want to run of the play that's already been called. So it might be an inside run power with 6 variations. Now they hold up the card that says, hey, we're going to fake this give and we're going to switch into the passing variant. So they take the handoff, fake the handoff, roll outside, and they're going to have 1 or 2 simple options for a receiver. The whole point is to get one-on-one matchups. But all the complexity is really going on the coaching side of it. There's some complexity in terms of all the variations the players have to know because there's all these different plays that can be run. But the problem for the players is essentially learning all the different plays and learning how to run all the plays at a high level. And that takes a lot of time through the season to get reps on. But what you're not asking the players to do is to learn a whole bunch of reads or a lot of concepts like that. Now, it can be really good because when those inside runs are working well and when teams start having to cheat, it lets the coaches pull the counter out themselves because they see the counter on the sideline in a way most college players can't really see on the field. This isn't the NFL, and they can execute it. However, it can also go bad when those bread and butter plays aren't very successful. Auburn historically under Malzahn has really struggled offensively, and I think the reason for that is they don't have the ability to create offense. Their whole thing is about exploiting some mismatch. If you can play them straight up and be successful, they're not going to use their routes to expose a hole and cover coverage. The quarterback isn't going to read coverage. If you can play them straight and have a man on a man and you can play too deep over the top, the quarterbacks and that system is just not designed to try to find space, create space for a receiver, read coverage in the way something adjusts, and they get really susceptible to robber coverage and whatnot. The big example is when Auburn rolled out Jeremy Johnson a few years ago, tried to go as a pass-first offense, get away from the run, and it was completely disastrous, frankly, because they just weren't really well equipped to try to do a pass-first offense, make the reads that were necessary. And it was pretty clear that Johnson hadn't really been coached or trained in a scheme that was able to do that at a high level.
Moving over to Washington, because this is another area where Auburn fans on the other side may not be super familiar with Washington. And we've seen in the past where teams from the Pac-12 have had overly inflated defensive numbers because of maybe the competition they play or the style of offense they play. And really, I think when Washington played Alabama in the first round of the playoffs a couple of years ago, they were coming in as like the number one rushing, or I think it was the number one rushing defense, and Alabama struggled offensively with Washington, but it wasn't a complete meltdown. And what we said leading up to that game was they were going to have a lot of trouble with Alabama's bigger running backs, and they did. I was interested to look at Washington's defense last year because I thought it was more of the same. But once I got into the numbers, it didn't seem that way. It seemed like they were legitimately good defensively. And, so I think I saw something where they allowed just a handful, like 6 or 8 offensive passing touchdowns all year, which was a pretty alarming stat. But then I looked at, okay, so they're ranked 5th overall in defense at the end of the year. And sometimes, and like we're going to get into with Michigan, those numbers are inflated because Michigan, I think the stat is they played 7 teams ranked 99th or worse in scoring offense. Well, and they only played 3 teams in the top 50. So I thought I'd see some of that with Washington, and I really didn't. I really didn't see a bunch of those bottom feeders that really help pad your defensive stats. So having said all that, in your opinion, what you know about Washington from last year, coming into this year, do you feel like their defense is legit and not sort of covered by poor opponents? And if so, could we see another situation like we saw with Auburn early in the season last year against Clemson, where they were completely inept offensively and then really hit their stride, later October, early November, but early in the year, they faced a good defensive team and it just wasn't there?
I think it's entirely possible. I think most Washington fans know, and maybe not as many Auburn fans, which it's kind of odd we're talking to Washington fans to a large extent, but Auburn fans may be more of the audience here. Washington returns all but, arguably 1 or 2 guys that were impact players in last year's defense. Now that one guy, Vita Vea, been around for a few years and was a real thorn in Alabama's side in that playoff game. But Washington across the board is a very good defense. I agree with you. I think they're an excellent defense. They move to the ball well, they tackle well, and I don't know that I completely agree with it. And I think you may want to touch on this in a minute, but a lot of pundits this year have been repeatedly saying that Auburn is the most likely team to disappoint. I remember seeing one of the ESPN segments where they had a round table before the college football season. And I think of the 6 pundits, 4 of the 6 said Auburn was the most likely team to disappoint in the top 15. I don't wholly buy that, but there is some truth to the fact that Auburn's turnover of the offensive line gives some concern. I think the turnover at running back is a major concern just because they don't have that schematic piece that they need to have. I think the receiving core has been banged up. They're good and they're fast, but there's a lot of stuff here that says those bread and butter plays, same thing that happened following the 2013 season, rely on a handful of players to execute. You need that offensive tackle, you need the guard to push, and those are the guys they're missing. The Prince, Tego Wanogo for Auburn came in that Clemson game, and I think an interesting parallel is he started that game, really struggled. They replaced him, and I felt like they got tremendously better when he wasn't in the lineup. And now he's pushed back into the starting lineup, probably at left tackle. So, yeah, I definitely think there's some parallels there. I definitely think Washington is a very good team. I am with you that, both of us were critical last year of Washington's schedule. Now, they by and large dominated that schedule, but we were really questioning it because we knew they were better than a lot of the really bad teams they played, and we didn't really know where they fell beyond that. But I do think it's entirely possible that they more or less shut down Auburn in this game. And if they do that, it could be very much a repeat of the Clemson game.
I'm glad you mentioned their schedule because I have historically been very vocal and very critical of Washington's schedule. Namely, look, you can't help who you play in conference, and you can't help that Colorado in 2017 wasn't the Colorado that they were in 2016. You can't help that Oregon State was one of the worst teams in college football history last year. They were just terrible. What you can help is starting the season with Rutgers, Montana, and Fresno State. You can make a debate that Fresno State they got lucky with. So Fresno State they were the second best team they beat on their schedule last year, and
In S&P Plus, I believe Fresno State was actually the best team on their schedule up
wow.
until Penn
So
State.
so at the end of the year, Washington State was ranked, but you know how that goes when teams, they're ranked when you play them and they fall out after the loss. But you can't roll out Rutgers, Montana, Fresno State and expect to be considered a playoff contender, because what we don't know about you, Washington, is how you fare against teams outside of the Pac-12. And then when you look at their schedule, they didn't play a ranked team until Washington State, who ultimately I think finished unranked, the very last game of the season. Now, they did play Stanford earlier in the year, who I do think ended up in the top 25, but Stanford was not a good football team last year. They were an okay football team. If you remember, they needed like just the luck of all luck fumble at the end of the game to not lose to Oregon State, who, by the way, Oregon State lost by like 35 to Colorado State. So I know transitive property, we don't play that game a lot, but if you're bad enough to lose by 30 plus to Colorado State, who was not good last year, then you have no business anywhere close to a ranked team. So they lost to Stanford. They gave up 30 in that game, which I don't think is a good look for Washington's defense. If we're talking about legitimacy, I want to step back and say that's not good, because Stanford was pretty poor last year. I know they've got a great running back, and I know he's a Heisman contender, but offensively in general, Stanford was not great. 35 against Penn State, I'm not really going to kill him for that. Trace McSorley had a good, not amazing game. And what's interesting, and this is where I'm going to go next with that, is specifically in that Penn State game. So we've talked about before how on the big stage, in big bowl games and big playoff games, a lot of times the scores are a lot higher than they normally would be, because it's just kind of that blow for blow heavyweight shootout where you see the offenses really take over. And I think that's kind of what we got in that game. But what's interesting to me in that game is how well Washington held their own offensively. And a guy that nobody wants to talk about is Myles Gaskin, who's just been consistent. He's been a great workhorse running back since he first came on the scene. I've always been pretty high on him. And Jake Browning didn't have a great game, but they did enough offensively to win that game. Saquon Barkley, 7.6 yards per carry is pretty amazing. But they did pick off Trace McSorley twice. So when we see that they have those kind of weapons coming back in Gaskin and Browning, there's an interesting opportunity here against an Auburn defense that's been much heralded. What I wonder with this Washington offense, and this is where I really would like for you to weigh in, because we saw this against Alabama where Jake Browning was hot all year, but when he didn't have the running game to support him, he couldn't dig them out of a hole. And what we know about Auburn defensively is they do a really good job of shutting down premier running backs, and they see them week in and week out, and they've done a really good job of that. Auburn might have some weaknesses in the secondary, but is Jake Browning the kind of guy that can take advantage of that if Gaskin is a non-factor?
I think the interesting thing is really coming down to how much Auburn loses in the back seven, where they stand in the front four, and sort of how those two things are going to interplay. And when I say that, Auburn last year probably had one of the best front sevens in college football, and it was probably an underrated point, particularly the end of the year. Like all teams, they got banged up off and on, but Jeff Allen was a major impact guy for them on the the rush end DN linebacker jack position, however you want to call it. But beyond that, when you got guys like Davidson, Brown, Russell, they're really good players. Now, obviously, Deshaun Davis is probably the best linebacker they had. One concern I have for Auburn is when they traded Trey Williams for Montavious Atkinson due to injury issues in the middle of the year, I felt like the defense took a notable step back. But beyond that, I'll be really curious to see how the corners and safeties fill in for Auburn. So to answer your question, I think a lot of this really hinges on, Auburn is going to do everything they can to win the line of scrimmage. And at times, Jake Browning has been overwhelmed when the defensive line got in the backfield. We definitely saw that 2 years ago when Washington played Alabama in a playoff game, Alabama essentially lived in Washington's backfield. And when Washington could get passes off, Pettis in the receiving core, Ross could get open and they could make plays on Alabama's secondary. But they spent way too much of that game just moving backwards. And by the end of the game, it more or less shut them down. And I think you've got the same concern here. I think Auburn's secondary is probably pretty beatable, especially considering the turnover in game one. They'll be beatable. But my concern really is, can Auburn's defensive line win the battle to such an extent that nothing else really matters? And it's not just shutting down Gaskin. I think they really go hand in hand. It's, can Gaskin do enough to keep them honest and to keep them off the quarterback? And if they can shut him down without effort, which is a different question, then I think it severely impacts the offense
All
as a
right,
whole.
so here's an interesting question. I think this isn't discussed a lot. I don't think Stidham gets enough credit for Auburn in terms of how good of a quarterback he actually is. Statistically, he was actually really good last year, and some people might argue that it's a system issue, but I think that offensive line didn't gel for a long time last season, and he still managed to put up a pretty good number. If you had to start a team tomorrow, regardless of scheme, or let's say you had to start a team tomorrow and you could pick the scheme fit for the quarterback, would you start that team with Stidham or with Browning?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Personally, I think I would actually pick Stidham.
I would too. Care to clarify why?
Browning is a consistent quarterback. I think he is a pretty smart guy. He's fairly mobile, but he definitely isn't a plus athleticism guy. He's not huge. He doesn't have a huge arm. He doesn't have tremendous velocity in his arm. Stidham is much more of a prototype NFL passer in build. Early last year, I took some flack for this because we did a video where I compared Stidham to Bo Wallace, and I said to me, there were a lot of parallels between Stidham and Bo Wallace. The first thing I said is, to get rid of this really weird at the time, what I thought was kind of a bizarre interpretation that Stidham was a hardcore dual threat quarterback. And I think a lot of Auburn fans maybe now understand what I was saying, that he's not. He's a guy that is a dual threat to a certain extent, but he is not even remotely a Nick Marshall or anyone of that nature. But what Stidham is a guy that can be mobile, but is a tall, big quarterback with a big arm. And, I kind of said he was Bo Wallace plus. And I think that's sort of a fair comparison, that he does get rattled when guys get in his face a lot. Probably do.
Good Bo,
Yeah,
not bad Bo.
right. And I say that because, we're comparing him to Browning. Browning can really struggle when he's getting pressured historically. And Stidham can too, but maybe is a little bit better at it. He's certainly, I think, a little bit more mobile than Browning. Not a knock on Browning. Stidham's just a more athletic guy all around. So I would take Stidham just because his potential is better. He has good traits in a lot of areas. And as I said, he's kind of, Bo Wallace, and a good quarterback all around, but definitely has a more active arm, and can hurt you in a lot of ways and can make some throws, frankly, that I don't think Browning can make.
And one last point before we get into some predictions, I think it's worth noting also that Auburn, the last couple of years we've been a little bit down on them at the wide receiver unit. I actually think the improvement at wide receiver for them is going to be the difference in this game, given what Washington lost over the last couple of years at wide receiver and Auburn's improvement. I think between the two, I think they're both going to face, well, I guess I'm kind of getting into my prediction. I think they're both going to face tremendous pressure from the opposing defenses, and both have talented quarterbacks. Neither running game, I think, will be very, very successful. I think the edge here is going to be Auburn at the wide receiver unit, which is interesting to say because, like I said, we've been down on them for a while. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and before I give my pick, would you say that's a fair assessment that they've got the edge there?
I think potentially. I mean, Washington has some really good receivers, and getting Chico McClatcher back is big. But yeah, no, Auburn's receiving core has taken a couple steps lately. Again, though, I'm going to give a big asterisk because those guys have missed so much time in fall camp. I'm not 100% sure on what we're going to see with Auburn rolling out purely in week one. But assuming they're all healthy, I think it's a fair statement.
So Auburn's laying 2.5 in this game. Obviously, Vegas thinks it's a really close game. I'm going to agree. I'm going to go Auburn 24, Washington 21, and it's to me. I don't think it's a pick 'em toss up. I do think Auburn's going to win the game. I know I'm only picking them to win by 3 points. I just think, and part of me is a little bit jaundiced by what I saw with Washington against the Alabama defense and their just inability to really move the ball at all. But I've got Auburn 24, Washington 21. What have you got?
Similar. I think it's going to be lower scoring. I have Auburn 21, Washington 17. I even flirted with 17-13, but obviously, at this point, when both of us, we've said this many times, if you're below 24 points in a game and the score's within a touchdown, you're talking about a lot of luck here. One fumbled punt, one thing going wrong will change the complexion of the game. And anytime you have really close defensive battles, you get a lot of weird results because football is such a weird sport that one play that goes weird, a defender falling down when he turns, gives up a long touchdown, which breaks open the game. Notre Dame LSU last year in the bowl game is a pretty good example of that. That one catch at the end of the game allowed Notre Dame team that beat an LSU team that by and large outplayed them through the course of the game. It's definitely one of those matchups in my mind. I think, to me, a big difference, you compared that Alabama game, we took a lot of heat because we said that Washington's back seven was going to struggle with the size of Alabama's running backs. I think Washington still has an issue playing an SEC team with the fact that their back seven is about 20 pounds lighter on average than an SEC team. I think, maybe given the big Scarborough run, maybe people understand what we meant there, that we felt like Alabama's running backs were almost uniquely big and powerful. And Scarborough in particular at 240 pounds was just unusual. And a lot of teams really have had issues the past several years in the conference without dealing with them. Washington, I don't think, is going to have that problem with Auburn this year. Auburn's receivers are not terribly big. Their running backs are not terribly big. That's definitely something that's going to play in Washington's favor in a way that wasn't true in the Alabama game. First, I want to note that wasn't some SEC bias thing. That was a unique aspect to Alabama. And then the second thing is, I think this is a much better matchup because of that for Washington than the Alabama game was. And a lot of it's just going to come down to how well Auburn's secondary plays. And to me, the key and the reason that I'm going with Auburn is going to be how well they can get in the backfield, because right now I think Auburn's experienced defensive line is probably the deciding factor of the game.
And what's your score? Okay, 21-17 Auburn. Okay. I think Washington fans are probably going to be a little upset. No respect, Rodney Dangerfield from an SEC Homer channel, but again, this is a close game that's really hard to pick. First, early in the season, we don't even do computer models yet. There's no data, so if Washington wins this game, I'm not going to be surprised. Will you be surprised?
Not at all. I mean, my pick is a 60-40, 65-35 kind of pick.
Yeah, so I think right now it's almost a devil you know situation where we do admittedly know a little bit more about Auburn, but we also follow Washington very closely because they're a national team at this point. They're in the playoff hunt every year now, and they're very well coached. They've had a great set of talent on both sides of the ball for the last few years. So it's not a slight, Washington fans. We would not be shocked if you win this game, but we are both picking Auburn. Surprise, surprise. The SEC homers picking the SEC team.